Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to go over one of the 50 myths from the 50 Myths book, and then I'm going to discuss some terminology that we'll be using a lot in this course. So, first, let's begin by discussing one of the myths from the 50 Myths book. Now, normally I am not going to cover the myths on the PowerPoint slides because you should be able to get the relevant information on your own from the textbook. But I did want to give you one example of the type of information that you should be focusing on. So, myth number 42 is that the full moon causes an increase in abnormal behaviors. So lots of negative events have been linked with a full moon. An increase in suicides, crimes, or people just going crazy. I'm specifically going to talk about the myth as causing an increase in admissions rates to psychiatric hospitals. So when you read each myth in preparation for the quizzes, I generally want you to focus on three questions. The first question is always going to be, what is the origin of this myth? So essentially, how did the myth come about? As we'll see, there's often a grain of truth to the myth, but when you look closer, you'll see that it's blown way out of proportion. So the origin of the current myth is ancient Greek and Roman legends concerning the power of the moon that are still popular nowadays. So legends of humans transforming into monsters like vampires and werewolves during a full moon date back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. These myths were popular in Europe during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. For example, they were referenced by Shakespeare. Similarly, the word lunatic or loony, used to describe a crazy person, derives from the Latin word luna, meaning moon. Even nowadays, this myth is widely believed. Around 70 to 80% of mental health professionals believe the myth, as do about 45% of college students. The second question you'll focus on is, why is the myth generally accepted? Examining this question may help us to determine how the breakdown in critical thinking occurred that ultimately led to the myth being believed. For myth number 42, I can think of two good reasons why the myth is generally accepted. The first is that the myth is commonly portrayed in movies and books and is supported by the notion that the moon can affect the Earth through its gravity. So you all have had lots of exposure to the notion that a full moon causes abnormal behaviors. There have been hundreds of movies portraying a relationship between full moons and monsters or people going crazy. The 50 Myths book also discusses how the psychiatrist Arnold Lieber popularized the idea of why there might be a correlation between full moon and abnormal behaviors. His argument is essentially that because humans are made up of 4/5 water, and because the moon's gravity affects the ocean's tides, its gravity may also affect people, causing them to go crazy. The second reason why this myth is generally accepted as true is due to confirmation bias. So remember, confirmation bias is the tendency to concentrate on or remember evidence that supports your beliefs and to ignore or forget information that doesn't. The problem with confirmation bias is that it leads us to only consider some of the evidence that which supports our beliefs and to ignore the evidence that would contradict our beliefs and show us that they are wrong. The textbook goes into great detail about how confirmation bias causes this belief by making people see an illusory correlation between these two variables. So this table depicts the four cells that are created when you look at the relationship between the moon type, either a full moon versus no full moon, and an increase in psychiatric hospital admissions rates. Either yes, there was an increase, or no, there was not an increase. So how does confirmation bias lead people to believe that a full moon causes an increase in psychiatric hospital admission rates? Well, here's the argument. First, people remember the times when there was a full moon and there was an increase in psychiatric hospital admissions. Basically, these are the incidents that fall in cell A, which are instances that are consistent with the myth. Because of confirmation bias, mental health professionals remember these cases and might comment on them to their friends, families, or coworkers. So they might say something like, ugh, I had 8 new patients today, and guess what? The moon was full. There you go with the full moon causing an increase in admissions rates and causing people to go crazy. However, people forget or ignore the times when the moon was full and there wasn't an increase in admissions. These are the incidents in cell B. It's not like these don't happen often. They do, but they're not the type of things someone would comment on, so these incidents go unnoticed. Right? Nobody ever says, ugh, I had my normal 3 new patients today, and guess what? The moon was full. That's just not something that people would comment on. Similarly, people forget or ignore the times when there was an increase in admissions, but the moon was not full. The incidents in cell C. So again, statistically speaking, these are just as common as incidents in cell A. But because they aren't as interesting, no one says, I had 8 new patients today, and guess what? We had a crescent moon. These cases are not remembered well, and people don't realize they are as common as the incidents in cell A. So to summarize, confirmation bias leads people to remember the cases that are consistent with their beliefs, but to forget the ones which aren't, which statistically speaking are just as common. The final question we're going to look at is, what evidence is there that this myth is false? Remember, like we said, the whole point of critical thinking is that our beliefs should be based on the evidence. So it's very important that we do focus on the evidence when deciding whether or not to accept a myth. Anyway, the first piece of evidence that our current myth is false is that there is no scientific basis for why a relationship between the moon's phase and abnormal behavior should exist based on gravity. So remember, Lieber's claim was that the moon's gravity can affect our behavior. His argument was that the moon's gravity affects the water on Earth, such as the ocean's tides, and because humans are mostly water, it can affect our behavior and mental processes. There are a couple of problems with this argument, though. One issue is that gravity is a very weak force. So pick up any object that's near you, a book, your laptop, anything. Once you have, congratulations, you just overcame the gravitational pull of the entire Earth, right? Gravity was pulling the object down, but you managed to pick it up. So gravity is a very weak force, and so the notion that an object other than the Earth can affect us through gravity is almost certainly wrong. Another problem is that the moon's gravitational effect on the Earth is particularly weak. The gravitational force that one object exerts on another is based primarily on its size and distance. So not only is gravity weak like we just discussed, but the moon is smaller than the Earth and farther away, and thus it exerts a very small gravitational effect on us. For example, a mosquito on your arm exerts about the same gravitational pull as the moon does. A mother holding her baby exerts 12 million times the gravitational force on her baby as the moon. So unless you think a mother holding her baby causes it to go crazy, you shouldn't believe this myth. And then the last problem is that the phase of the moon has essentially no effect on the moon's gravitational effect on the Earth. So as the moon goes through its different phases, it remains the same distance from the Earth. And remember, like I said, the gravitational force that one object exerts on another is based on its size and distance. And so the force of gravity that the moon exerts on the Earth is essentially the same during a full moon versus any other type of moon because it's always the same distance away. And so there's very little reason to believe that the moon should affect the Earth based on its gravitational pull. The second piece of evidence that the myth is false is that studies have failed to find a relationship between the phase of the moon and increases in abnormal behavior. The 50 Myths book talks about how over 100 studies have investigated the relationship between a full moon and variables like murder rates, crime rates, suicides, psychiatric problems, psychiatric hospital admissions, or calls to crisis centers, and have failed to find a relationship. So when the myth has been investigated, no evidence has been found to support it. Now, for me, whether or not to believe this myth is pretty straightforward. However, in everything we talk about in this course, you'll need to make up your own mind about what to believe. That is, the point of this course is not for me to tell you what to believe. This philosophy that I expect you all to be independent, innovative, critical thinkers who will do exactly as I say and believe exactly as I believe doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. Instead, my goal for this course is for me to teach you how to evaluate claims and why it's important to do so. So I don't want you to believe that a myth is false because I tell you it's false. I want you to believe it's false because you've considered the evidence and you decide that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that the myth is false on your own. So instead, I want you to be the right kind of open-minded critical thinker. I don't want you to be so open-minded that you believe everything, but I don't want you to be so closed-minded that you won't consider new things that are well supported by the evidence. Instead, the mindset that I want to cultivate is all claims are given a fair hearing, but only those that meet high evidential standards are retained. On Canvas, I posted a link to a video on YouTube that talks more about this idea of being the right kind of open-minded critical thinker, and I definitely encourage you to view it. The last thing I want to do today is to go over some basic terminology and specifically to discuss the differences between assertions and arguments. So first, let's define assertions. An assertion is a statement claiming that something has some characteristic, for example, that some claim is true. Assertions are open to dispute and can either be true or false. So let's say you're having a conversation with a friend about violence in our society. Your friend might say to you something like, "People today are more violent than they were in the past." This would be an example of an assertion because your friend is simply claiming that something, in this case people, have some characteristic, in this case that they are violent. Here's another example. Most people with mental illness are faking. This is just an assertion. We're simply claiming that something, most people with mental illness, show some characteristic, are faking. Other examples would be things like there is intelligent life on other planets, high fructose corn syrup is bad for you, gluten is bad for you, Iron Man would beat Gandalf in a fight, Wikipedia is accurate. All of these would be assertions. Now, one thing that's missing from assertions is a reason to believe them, what we're calling evidence in this class. So evidence is a source of knowledge or a reason for believing that an assertion is true. As I've mentioned, we'll spend some time discussing different types of evidence in this course, like common sense, anecdotes, and statements from authority, and the strengths and weaknesses of each type. Right now, the main point is that regular assertions lack evidence. Again, an assertion is just a claim that something is true. It doesn't have evidence to support it. So yeah, one should be reluctant to believe assertions that are not presented with supporting evidence. Perhaps the person forgot to include a piece of evidence, or maybe that person doesn't have any evidence to support their assertion. And of course, you can make whatever assertions you want, but that doesn't make them true, right? You can make an assertion that the full moon leads to an increase in admissions rates to psychiatric hospitals, that President Obama was born in Kenya, or that President Trump colluded with the Russians. In fact, listen to most speeches made by politicians, and you'll hear a lot of claims and assertions, but very little evidence to support them. Now, we have a special term for assertions that are presented with supporting evidence. We're going to call them arguments. An argument is an assertion with evidence to support it. So when we use the term argument colloquially, we usually think of two people yelling at each other in a heated debate. However, when we say that someone makes an argument in critical thinking, we simply mean that he or she is making an assertion with evidence to support it. Often when you see a word like because or since or therefore, that's a good indicator that an argument was made, but not always. Here are a couple of examples of arguments. I believe that smoking causes cancer, since people who smoke cigarettes are more likely to get cancer than those who don't. So this is an argument because we have an assertion or statement, smoking causes cancer, with evidence to support it, that people who smoke are more likely to get cancer. Or here's another example. I think people today are less violent than they were in the past because crime rates have fallen in the past 20 years. Again, we have an assertion, a claim about violence, and it's supported by a piece of evidence that crime rates have fallen in the past 20 years. And then depending on the quantity and quality of the evidence, the argument may or may not be believed. So yeah, keep in mind that technically, an argument is simply a claim with evidence to support it, while non-arguments lack supporting evidence. Arguments can be based on any kind of evidence, either good or bad evidence, and so if an argument is ultimately based on bad evidence, it's still an argument, but we probably wouldn't want to believe it, again, because the support for it is poor. Another key point is to be on the lookout for statements like this one. I think that abortion is wrong. I have always believed that and always will. Those who favor abortion on demand are just plain wrong. In fact, those who favor any kind of abortion for any reason are wrong. They may be sincere in their beliefs and they may have the Supreme Court on their side, but they're still advocating an immoral act. So realize that this is not an argument. It's simply a collection of assertions. However, this is often the type of reasoning that people give for believing a claim, such that abortion is wrong. Note that I'm not saying that I do or don't agree with this position. I'm just pointing out that because no evidence is being presented here, that no argument has been made. And so we shouldn't find the statement to be very convincing from a critical thinking standpoint because no evidence was presented. And then the final new piece of terminology I want us to know is counter-argument. which is an assertion with supporting evidence that contradicts a first argument. So not that kind of counter-argument, okay, but with the counter-argument, someone makes an argument, they present an assertion with evidence to support it, and in response, you come up with a counter-argument, the opposite assertion with evidence to support it. One point I'll make is that people generally aren't good at identifying and coming up with counter-arguments on their own, especially ones that contradict their beliefs, likely due to confirmation bias. Right, so because people tend to focus solely on the evidence that supports their beliefs and to ignore contradictory evidence, it makes it difficult for us to realize that there are contradictory viewpoints and that they might even have as much or even more support than the viewpoints that we agree with. All right, that's all I have for today's PowerPoint.